She had already made up her mind to die. Not dramatically, not with a note or a goodbye. She simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, and lay down on the floor of her room in Toronto's West End, waiting for whatever came next. The year was 1907. Her name was Agnes Winnifred Bourne, and she was 31 years old, and the doctors had told her family there was nothing more to be done. What happened next is the reason we are here. Agnes grew up in a Methodist household in Hamilton, Ontario, the second of 4 children born to a railroad clerk and his wife. Her father, Harold Bourne, was a quiet man who read his Bible at the kitchen table every morning before the sun came up. Her mother, Eleanor, was the kind of woman who kept the house running through 2 recessions and a fire without raising her voice once. Faith was not a Sunday performance in that home. It was the air they breathed. Agnes was bright, unusually so. By the time she was 12, she was reading theology beside her father, asking questions that made him set down his coffee and think, what does it mean to be healed? If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, why do people keep dying of things they're praying about? Her father didn't always have answers. But he never told her the questions were wrong. She trained as a nurse, not because nursing was considered a respectable profession for a young woman, though it was, but because she genuinely believed that caring for the body and praying for the soul were the same act. She worked first in Hamilton, then moved to Toronto in 1902 to take a position at a hospital on College Street. She was good at the work, steady, calm in crisis, the kind of nurse other nurses wanted beside them when things went wrong. And things went wrong often enough. She had watched people die, held their hands, sat with families in the hallway afterward. She had seen what faith looked like up close in a person's final hours, the terror, the peace, sometimes both at once. She did not romanticize any of it. She had too much experience for that. In the winter of 1904, she began to feel something she could not name, a heaviness in her lungs that came and went, a fatigue that sleep didn't touch. She ignored it for 8 months because she was a nurse, and she knew how easy it was to catastrophize, and because she was busy, and because she did not want it to be what it was. By the spring of 1905, she could not ignore it anymore. The diagnosis came back in May. Tuberculosis, advanced both lungs. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent 3 years caring for others. She had held basins and changed dressings and spoken gently to men who were coughing their last breath into linen. And now here she was. She went home to her family in Hamilton to recover. The word recover is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. What she actually did was decline, slowly, over the next 2 years in her childhood bedroom, while her mother brought soup she couldn't finish, and her father read Psalms in the chair by the window, and her younger sister Clara tried not to cry in front of her. The doctors were honest. That was one thing. They told Harold Bourne directly, "Your daughter's lungs are beyond what medicine can do. We can try to keep her comfortable. We cannot reverse this." Agnes heard that through the wall. She was not supposed to, but the houses of that era were not built for privacy, and she heard every word her father said and every word the doctor said in response, and she lay in her bed afterward and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. That night she had what she later described not as a vision but as a conversation. She was not asleep. She was fully awake, in the dark, in pain, and she said, not dramatically, not out loud, just in the plainest possible way, "If you are real, then this is the moment I need to know." She did not get a light. She did not hear a voice. What she got was a stillness that she said felt different from any stillness she had known before, as if the room itself had become attentive. She lay in it for a long time and then, eventually, she slept. The next morning she asked her sister to bring her the book of Isaiah. She wasn't looking for comfort verses. She was looking for something specific. She didn't know what. She read for 2 hours. She got to chapter 53 and she stopped. "By his wounds we are healed." She had read that line 100 times. She had memorized it as a child. But something about it that morning sat differently, as if she were reading it for the first time, in a language she had only just learned. She wrote in her journal, a journal she had kept since she was 14, in a careful small hand, "I think I have been asking God to be comfortable in my dying. I have not once asked him to heal me." She decided to ask. Not with ceremony, not with a great public declaration. She was alone in her room at 6 in the morning with Isaiah open on her lap, and she simply said, "I am asking." Nothing happened that day. or the next. But 3 days later, she woke up and realized she had slept the entire night without coughing. This may sound like a small thing. It was not a small thing. She had not slept a full night in 14 months. She had learned to sleep in increments, propped on pillows, waking every hour or two to cough into a cloth she kept by her bed. She sat up slowly that morning, waiting for the coughing to start. It did not start. She did not tell anyone. Not immediately. She was a nurse. She knew that one good night could mean almost nothing. She had watched patients have good days right before the end. She wasn't going to build a theology on a night's sleep, but the next night was the same, and the one after that. By the end of the first week, she was eating in a way she hadn't in over a year. By the end of the second week, she was walking to the end of the hall and back without stopping to rest. Her mother watched all of this with an expression that Agnes described in her journal as caught between terror and hope. Like someone who has been so long in the dark, they're afraid the light is a trick. She went back to the doctor in Hamilton 6 weeks after that morning with Isaiah. He examined her. He was quiet for a long time. He asked her to come back the following week. She did. He was quiet again. He told her, carefully, that what he was seeing was not consistent with what he had seen 6 weeks prior. He said he could not explain it. He said the word remarkable, and then stopped himself as if he wasn't sure what he was allowed to say. Agnes was calm. She thanked him and went home and wrote 3 pages in her journal. She went back to Toronto in the spring of 1907. She was 31 years old and she was supposed to be dead. Instead, she walked into the hospital on College Street where she had worked and asked if they needed nurses. They hired her back the same afternoon. But she was not the same woman who had left. The Agnes who had returned from Hamilton had a question burning in her that she could not let go of. If what had happened to her was real, and she believed with the whole of her being that it was, then why wasn't the church talking about it? Not the sentimental way, not as an abstract hope for somewhere after death. Why wasn't anyone teaching people that healing was available now? In the body, in this life, in the plain way that the scriptures seemed to say it was. She started asking that question publicly in 1908. Not at first in churches. She had no platform, no credentials, no denomination that would have her. She started in living rooms, 3 or 4 people at a time. She would share what had happened to her, and then open the Bible and show what she had found there. And then she would pray, genuinely, practically, specifically, for whoever in the room was sick. People came back, and they brought others. By 1910, she was holding weekly gatherings in a rented hall on Spadina Avenue. By 1912, the hall was too small. She was not performing. That was the thing people said over and over, the ones who came skeptical and stayed. She was not charismatic in the theatrical sense. She was not loud. She did not work the room. She sat with people one at a time and listened to them and asked what they believed about God's willingness to help them, and then she prayed. She was also a nurse. She never lost that. She believed in medicine. She never told anyone to stop their treatment. She understood the body. She would look at a person and see both what was happening physically and what was happening spiritually, and she held both without collapsing one into the other. That was unusual for that era. That was unusual for any era. The healings, and there were healings, documented, witnessed, spoken of by people who had no reason to exaggerate, were not the point, she always said. The point was that God had not withdrawn. The point was that the same presence she had encountered in that bedroom in Hamilton in 1904 was available to anyone who wanted it. The healings were evidence of a nearness, not proof in the scientific sense. Evidence in the relational sense. She was not without critics. The medical establishment viewed her with suspicion, then with open hostility. She was a woman. She was practicing something that looked to some like medicine without a license. She was speaking to groups about healing without the endorsement of any official church body. In 1913, she received a formal complaint from a physician who claimed she had told a patient to stop a prescribed medication. She had not. She had documentation. The complaint was dropped, but the suspicion did not go away. The churches had their own objections. The cessationist position, the view that miracles had ended with the apostles, was the dominant theology of most Canadian Protestant churches at the time. What Agnes was teaching contradicted that directly. She was called a fanatic. She was called deluded. One particularly pointed editorial in a Toronto religious newspaper in 1914 called her a well-meaning woman who has mistaken her own experience for universal doctrine. She kept a copy of that editorial in her journal. She did not respond to it publicly, but she wrote underneath it in that same careful small hand, perhaps. But I was there. She also had the criticism she took more seriously. The concern that she was raising false hope in people who were dying. This was not a facile objection. She felt the weight of it. She had been a nurse. She had sat beside people who did not get better. She had prayed with them and they had died. She did not pretend that prayer was a guarantee of a particular outcome. She did not tell people that if they had enough faith they would be healed, and if they weren't healed it was because their faith was insufficient. She said that explicitly, regularly, with real force. She had watched that theology break people. She would not carry it. What she said instead, and this is worth sitting with, was that the prayer was not a transaction. It was a relationship. She was not presenting God with a valid invoice for healing in exchange for sufficient belief. She was bringing a person into contact with a presence that she knew to be real, and trusting that presence to be what it had always said it was. The outcome was not hers to determine. The access was. That distinction mattered. It was also, for some of her critics, insufficient. They wanted guarantees. She could not give them. She gave them honesty instead. In 1915, in the middle of the First World War, Agnes opened a small residence on Brunswick Avenue in Toronto. She called it a house of prayer, though it functioned as something between a prayer room and a clinic and a shelter, depending on what the day required. She had 3 women working with her by that point. One a former schoolteacher from Guelph named Dorothy, one a recent immigrant from Scotland named Maisie, and one whose name in the records appears only as Mrs. G. They worked without salary for the first year. Agnes sold a set of furniture her mother had given her to keep the lights on. She wrote to her father that winter, "I don't know where the money will come from. I know why I'm here." Harold Bourne, who was by then in his 70s and in poor health himself, wrote back, "That's usually enough." The war years were a particular kind of darkness. Agnes worked with families whose sons were coming back from France in pieces, or not coming back at all. She prayed with grieving mothers. She prayed with men who could not sleep, who had seen things they could not speak of. She was careful with those men. She did not rush them toward healing or assurance. She sat with the darkness alongside them, and did not pretend it was smaller than it was. There is a letter from 1917, preserved in a small archive at a library in Hamilton, where her papers were eventually donated, from a widow named Frances, whose husband had died at Vimy Ridge. Frances wrote, "You did not tell me it would be all right. I needed someone to not tell me that. You sat with me for 2 hours and said almost nothing, and it was the most helpful thing anyone did for me in that whole year." Agnes did not keep copies of her replies, but she kept letters like that one. She never married. This was not for lack of opportunity. Several accounts mention it obliquely, but because she felt that the work she had been given required a kind of availability that marriage, in the structure of that era, would have made difficult. She was not romantic about this. She was practical. She had looked at the shape of her life and made a calculation. She did not advertise it or make a principle of it. It was simply what she had decided. By 1920, she was well known enough to be invited to speak at churches across Ontario. She accepted some invitations and declined others. She had become discerning about what platforms were genuinely interested in what she was carrying, and which ones wanted something more theatrical. She was not theatrical. She was not going to become theatrical to fill someone else's hall. She visited England twice, in 1921 and 1924. She visited Keswick in the Lake District, where a convention of Christian holiness movements had been gathering annually since the 1870s. She spoke there in 1921 to a gathering of perhaps 400 people. The response was different than she expected, not because of what she said what she always said, but because of the particular silence that followed. She wrote in her journal that night, "It was as if everyone in the room had been hungry for a very long time and hadn't admitted it." She returned to Canada in 1921 with a sense that something was shifting, not just in her own work but broadly. There were more people asking the questions she had been asking since 1904. The Pentecostal movement, which had its roots in Azusa Street in Los Angeles in 1906, had been growing steadily. Agnes was not Pentecostal, technically. She resisted denominations on principle, but she was moving in overlapping currents. She knew people in that world. She respected some of them. She had serious disagreements with others. She was particularly wary of what she saw as the spectacle problem, the tendency of healing meetings to become performances, to prioritize demonstration over formation, to make the healer the center of the story, rather than the presence they were pointing toward. She had seen what that did over time. She had watched men and women who started with genuine gifts allow those gifts to become their identity, and then their product, and then something else entirely. She wrote about this in a long letter in 1925 to a colleague in Vancouver. The moment a person begins to trade on what God has done through them, something has already gone wrong. The gift is not the point. The giver is. She would think of that letter later, when certain things happened that she had not anticipated. In 1927, a man named Reginald Holt came to Brunswick Avenue. He was charismatic, educated, articulate. He had heard of Agnes's work and came presenting himself as an ally, someone who wanted to support and extend what she was doing. He had money, he had connections. He was persuasive in the way that certain men of that era were persuasive, competent and confident and just plausible enough. Agnes was cautious. Her colleague Dorothy was more cautious still. Maisie, who had known some hard men in Scotland, said nothing for the first 3 meetings and then pulled Agnes aside afterward and said, simply, "Be careful with this one." Agnes was careful, but she was also tired, and the house on Brunswick was always short of funds, and Reginald had both ideas and resources, and his theology, at first, sounded like hers. It became clear over the following 2 years that it was not. Reginald was interested in healing as a public event. He wanted to hire a larger hall. He wanted to advertise. He wanted to invite journalists. He wanted testimonials documented and circulated. He believed, genuinely, Agnes thought not cynically, that scale was the goal, that the message would spread further if the platform were bigger. He was not wrong about that, exactly, but he was wrong about something more important. Agnes ended the partnership in 1929. It cost her. Reginald had access to donors she no longer had. 3 of the families that had been supporting Brunswick Avenue quietly withdrew after he left. The house almost closed. She spent 4 months not knowing if she could keep it open. She wrote very little in her journal during those 4 months. There is one entry from November 1929, 2 weeks after the stock market collapsed. Everything feels stripped. I keep going back to the year I was sick. I had nothing then either. I had one morning with 1 book. That was enough. The house stayed open. She was 53 years old. She did not have the energy she'd had at 31. She was careful with herself now in ways she had not been careful before. She slept more. She prayed earlier in the morning, before the day could crowd it out. She had learned, through 20 years of watching other people burn out in this kind of work, that the secret place was not a discipline you maintained for the sake of your ministry. It was what your ministry came from. The moment it became the other way around, something essential was already draining away. The women who worked with her in those later years, Dorothy had stayed, and there were 2 newer ones, younger women named Vera and Catherine, said that what set Agnes apart was not what she did in public. It was what she did when no one was watching. She was up before 5. She was in her small room at the back of the house with the door closed. They could hear sometimes, not words exactly, but a quality of sound, as if someone were having a real conversation with someone who was genuinely present. Not performance, not formula, something that sounded like long familiarity. Vera, who later wrote a short memoir of her time on Brunswick Avenue, said, "I understood after a while that everything that happened on the public side of that house came from what happened in that back room. That was the source. Everything else was just the current that ran from it." Agnes continued working until 1938. She was 62. A second wave of illness came. This time her heart, not her lungs, and she spent the last 4 years of her life in a quieter mode, writing, corresponding, meeting with individuals one at a time, training the women who had gathered around her to carry the work forward. She was not worried about legacy. She was explicit about this. She had seen too many people in this world sacrifice the work for the sake of the record. She told Catherine in 1940, "When I'm gone, what matters is not that people remember me. What matters is whether what I pointed to is still real for them. If they've found that, really found it, not just a feeling about it, then it doesn't matter at all whether they know my name." She died on a Tuesday in February 1942. She was 66 years old. The Brunswick Avenue house had a small service. Dorothy, now in her 70s herself, read from Isaiah 53. Vera sang. There were perhaps 30 people in the room. There were also letters. Letters from across the country, and from England, and from at least 3 provinces in Canada, where people Agnes had never met had received correspondence from her, or had met someone she had trained, or had heard a story that had changed the way they understood what was available to them. A man in Nova Scotia wrote to Dorothy after Agnes died. He had been diagnosed with a condition the doctors called permanent, he said, and he had encountered Agnes's teaching through a pamphlet that had reached him somehow in 1931. He wrote, "I do not know how to explain what happened except to say that what she pointed toward was real. I found it. She was right." Dorothy kept that letter. She kept all of them. The Brunswick Avenue house continued until 1951. The work that began there threaded forward through the women Agnes had trained, and the letters she had written, and the one morning in 1904 when a 31-year-old nurse lay alone in her childhood bedroom in Hamilton and asked a single, plain, terrifying question and heard, in the silence that followed, something that sounded like yes. What are you carrying right now that you haven't yet brought to that kind of stillness? What would it mean to stop asking to be comfortable in your difficulty and simply ask? Plainly, without performance, without a guarantee of the outcome, to be helped. Agnes Winnifred Bourne did not build a denomination. She did not build a famous ministry. She built a back room and she went there every morning and she let everything else come from that. That was enough to change everything it touched. If you want to know more about lives like hers, ordinary people who found something extraordinary and gave their whole lives to pointing others toward it, subscribe to Heart of Witnesses. We're not here to give you a spectacle. We're here to show you what's possible when someone pays the full price. And if Agnes's story moved you, tell us in the comments. Whose story should we tell next?